This week on the show, we are looking at how the reimplementation of NetBSD is progressing using the microkernel. We check out how to make DHCP faster and see what kind of high process count support for DragonflyBSD has been developed. And of course, what people have been waiting for a long time now, we answer your questions that you sent to us in our interview section this week. So stick with us for this week's episode of BSD. Now. BSD Now, episode 210, Your Questions, Part 1, recorded for September 6, 2017. Hi, I'm your host, Benedikt Reuschling.
And I'm Alan Jude.
And we have a great show prepared for you because in this episode, we're going to start answering your viewer interview questions that you've been sending us over the last few weeks. But before we do that, we should get right into our headlines this week. So we have to wait a little bit longer.
Yep. We'll get to it, don't worry.
We'll get to it, yeah. So the first story is by actual Minix author Andy Tannenbaum of Minix fame. I guess people know him and he doesn't need a big introduction. And he has written 2 articles that we will have in the show today about the reimplementation of NetBSD using a microkernel.
Yeah, so accompanying this video is actually, or of the text, is a video that he presented at BSDCan in 2016 or 15.
Yeah, one of those two. Yeah.
But yeah, it goes on to say the Minix 3 microkernel is actually constructed a system that to a user looks like NetBSD, right? It has package source, it uses all the NetBSD headers and libraries, and it passes over 80% of NetBSD's Q attests. All of it, it basically looks like NetBSD. However, inside, the system is completely different. At the very bottom is a small 13,000 lines of code microkernel that just handles interrupts, message passing, low-level scheduling, and hardware-related details. Almost all of the actual operating system, including memory management, file systems, paging and swapping, and all of the device drivers run as user mode processes and are protected by the MMU, the memory management unit. As a consequence, failures or security issues in one component cannot spread to the other ones. In some cases, a failed component can be replaced automatically and on the fly while the system is running and without a regular user process even noticing it. The talk will discuss the history, goals, technologies, and status of the project.
Mm-hmm. And it continues with research at the Vrije Universiteit, which is the name for the university in the Netherlands that he's teaching at.
I think it's a free university, right?
Free, it's, the way they spell that. This has resulted in a reimplementation of NetBSD using a microkernel instead of a traditional monolithic kernel. To the user, the system looks a great deal like NetBSD. And it passed over 80% of the Q tests. So this is the test suite that they have. It's also been ported to FreeBSD, by the way.
That whole paragraph seems rather redundant, considering it said the same thing in the paragraph above.
So this is what they said about this. And but the latest work has been adding live updates, making it possible to upgrade to a new version of the operating system without a reboot and without running processes even noticing. So this is pretty much going back in the background here.
Nice. Yeah, that's the point of a microkernel. That's pretty interesting.
And they say that no other operating system can do this.
Most of the other ones, even if they have something kind of like this, it involves some amount of restarting things. Sometimes not a whole reboot, but you have to at least restart the userland processes and stuff.
And as a summary of the whole thing is that the system is built on Minix 3, a derivative of the original Minix system, which many people probably know in the Unix world, which was intended for education. However, after the original author, Andrew Tannenbaum, received a €2 million grant from the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences and a 2.5 million euro grant from the European Research Council, the focus changed to building a highly reliable, secure, fault-tolerant operating system with an emphasis on embedded systems. The code is open source and can be downloaded from www.minix3.org. It runs on the x86 and ARM Cortex V8, like the bagel bones that you might have in your home network setup, maybe. Since 2007, the website has been visited over 3 million times, and the bootable image has been downloaded over 600,000 times. The talk will discuss the history, goals, technology, and status of the project.
Yep, and there's a whole part 2 if you're interested in how that one works.
Yep, these are the latest updates that they have there.
Mm-hmm. It's looking pretty interesting, especially when because you get a NetBSD compatible user land, it means your general applications are all there in package source and just work. It seems like it's a microkernel that might actually be usable.
Yeah, I remember the talk he gave at EuroBSDCon in Sofia the same year. That was really interesting to see the person like Andy Tannenbaum is there and talking about this. There was a lot of excitement in the NetBSD camp about the announcement that they made there.
Yep. So our next story is about rapid DHCP, or how do Macs get on the network so fast? The idea here is to analyze it and see if we can't replicate it. So the author, David Simmons, goes on to say, one of life's minor annoyances is having to wait for my device to connect to the network after it wakes up from sleep. All too often, I'll open the lid of my EEE PC netbook, enter a web address, and get the dreaded "this website is not available" message because the machine is still working on connecting to the Wi-Fi network or getting DHCP. On some occasions, I have twiddled my thumbs for as long as 15 seconds before the network is ready to be used. The frustrating thing is that I know it doesn't have to be this way. I know this because I have a Mac. When I open the lid on my MacBook Pro, it connects to the network nearly instantaneously. In fact, no matter how fast I am, the network comes up before I can even load a web page. My curiosity got the better of me, and I set out to investigate how Mac is actually able to connect to the network so quickly, and how the network connect time of other operating systems can be improved. So he figures there are 3 main time-consuming bits for bringing up the network. The first is link establishment. This is the ability of establishing communication with the network's link layer. In this case, Wi-Fi, the radio must be powered on, the access point detected, and the optional encryption established. After link establishment, the device is able to send and receive Ethernet frames on the network. Then you have DHCP, right? Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. Through DHCP handshaking, the device negotiates an IP address for it to use on the local network. The DHCP server is responsible for managing the IP addresses available on that network. And then there's miscellaneous overhead. The operating system must perform any number of mundane tasks during the processing of network initialization, running scripts, looking up network settings from a local database, launching programs, etc. So he says, my investigation thus far is primarily concerned with the DHCP phase. Although the other 2 categories would be interesting to study in the future, I set up a packet capture environment with a spare wireless access point and observed the network activity of the number of devices as they initialize their network connection. For the worst case scenario, let's look at the network activity capture while an Android tablet is connecting. This tablet, presumably in the interest of optimization, is initially skipping the DHCP discovery phase and immediately requesting its previous IP address. The only problem is that this is a different network, so the DHCP server ignores these requests. After about 4.5 seconds, the tablet stubbornly tries to request its old IP address. After another 4.5 seconds, it resigns itself to starting from scratch and performs an initial DHCP discovery needed to obtain an IP address from the new network. He says, in all fairness, this delay wouldn't be so bad if the device was connected to the same network as it was previously using. However, notice that the tablet waits a full 1.13 seconds after link establishment to even think about starting the DHCP process. Engineering snappiness usually means finding lots of little opportunities to save a few milliseconds here and there, and someone definitely dropped the ball there. And it shows a packet capture from a Samsung Galaxy Tab 10.1. it says, in contrast, let's look at a packet dump from the machine with the lightning fast network initialization and see what we can uncover, the magic of what's going on under the hood. The key to understanding the magic in the first 3 unicast ARP requests. It looks like macOS remembers certain information about not only the last connected network, but the last several networks. In particular, it must at least persist the following sets of information for each network: the Ethernet address of the DHCP server, the IP address of the DHCP server, and its own IP address as assigned by the previous DHCP server. So as we see the network come up, we see it sends an ARP request asking who has a certain IP address. Its linked local address, making sure that works or isn't conflicted. Then it sends an ARP request for a specific IP address, or 2 in this case. And then it gets a reply from one of them, being one of the DHCP servers, and then it knows that DHCP server is alive. So then it first tries to request its old address from that DHCP server to detect it. And if it hadn't, it would have, done the regular process.
Mm-hmm.
So during the network initialization, the Mac transmit carefully crafted unicast ARP requests with this stored information. For each network in its memory, it attempts to send a request to the static Ethernet address of the DHCP server for that network, in which it asks for this server's IP address and requests that the server reply to its IP address, which the Mac has formerly used on this network. Unless network hosts have been radically shuffled around, at least one of these ARP requests will result in a response. The request corresponding to the correct network if the current network happens to be one of the remembered networks. This network recognition technique allows the Mac to very rapidly discover if it's connected to a known network. If the network is recognized, and presumably if the Mac knows that the DHCP lease is still active, it immediately and presumptuously configures its IP address with the address it knows is good on that network. And then it performs a self-ARP to make sure that nobody else is already using that address. The DHCP handshaking process begins in the background by sending a DHCP request for its assumed IP address, but the network interface is available for use during the handshaking process. So even if the DHCP server is slow, it's already using that IP address because it assumes it's going to work. If the network was not recognized, I assume the Mac would know to begin the DHCP discovery phase instead of sending blind requests for a former IP address like the Galaxy Tab does. So, the Galaxy tablet tries really hard to get the IP address it had before. The Mac very quickly tries to determine if it's on the same network. And if it is, it starts using that previous IP address and then tries to get a renewed lease for it. So it takes a lot less time to get up and running. The Mac's rapid network initialization can be credited for more than just the network recognition scheme. Judging by the use of ARP, which is can be problematic to deal with in user space, and the unusual regular transmission interval, a reliable 1.0 milliseconds between each packet sent, I'm guessing that the Mac's DHCP client system is entirely implemented as a tight kernel code. The Mac began the IP initialization process a mere 10 milliseconds after link establishment, which is far faster than the other devices he tested. The Android device, such as the Galaxy Tab, rely on a user mode DH client system, part of the DHCP CD package, which is no doubt brings a lot of additional overhead, such as loading the program, context switching, and perhaps even running scripts. The next step for some daring kernel hacker is to implement a similarly aggressive DHCP client system in the OS kernel, so that it can enjoy fast sign-on speeds with your tablet or your desktop or your laptop or whatever. There already exists a minimal DHCP client implementation for the Linux kernel, but it lacks certain features such as configuring the DNS name servers. Perhaps it wouldn't be too much work to extend the code to support network recognition and interface with a user daemon that'll handle the ancillary configuration. And, if I ever get a few spare cycles, maybe I'll take a stab at it. They also say you can also find other ways of optimizing the DH client program, and they have a link to a tutorial there.
Yeah, that's the one I use. It shaves a couple of seconds off from the whole process. You usually don't get to see much benefit by the whole process because it's already optimized in the way that the developers intended to. But yeah, some people might see it.
Using the ARP to quickly determine if we're on the same network instead of using the DHCP protocol to do that is an interesting hack.
Yeah, it's much more lower level.
The downside of it is that it's not something that the DH client can do very easily. It pretty much is a kernel level thing.
Yeah, this has to be implemented, and since the DH client package is pretty much operating system, carried over
agnostic,
into many of those. Yeah, then it will be difficult to have all these kernel changes included in that.
I don't know.
Or at least you had to have a couple of.
If I moved networks enough to care, I might look at trying to make it better. But
yeah, but in general, I mean, the whole DHCP process is quick enough so that it nowadays isn't that much of a slowdown anymore. I mean, for a laptop, it's difficult or different because you close it and open it in a different network each time, I guess, when you walk around with it. But do you really have to wait that long to do all the DHCP again, all over?
There's some extra updates at the bottom of this article since I read it last. It points out that what Apple's doing apparently is RFC 4436, detecting network attachment in IPv4. So there's actually a spec on how to do this. So it seems more reasonable to actually be something we could implement. That's cool. And then another one they point out as part of the problem he was seeing with the Galaxy tablet was actually a misconfiguration of the DHCP server he had set up for the testing. It wasn't set to be authoritative. It was set to be, so it would delay a bit and answer after giving other DHCP servers a chance in case, it wasn't authoritative, so that it doesn't accidentally break other people's networks when it gets turned on, a rogue DHCP server. But that stops it from sending a NAC or negative acknowledgement. So once that's enabled, if you look at what the Galaxy tab does, it sends out the request for the old IP address, and then the DHCP server immediately says, sorry, that's not this network. You can't have that. So it causes it to do a discover, and it gets its IP address in 2.6 seconds instead of waiting 4.5 seconds twice before even starting the process.
Oh, yeah, that's noticeable. Yeah, we should make a point of asking next time we come upon one of our network developers to ask about any DHCP improvements that they have in mind, maybe.
Yeah, that particular RFC looks like an interesting thing to look at.
Okay, but it's not only packets we're sending around, we're also sending around people to conferences, and they report back. In case in the FreeBSD Foundation, they write a trip report after their hopefully successful trip. And this week we have a trip report from Michael Lucas about BSD Cambridge that we just had 2 weeks ago. By the time you watched this, it's been a little bit while back, a little further back, but this is pretty much still fresh in our memories, so we can get a lot of the things he writes about still from our own recollections here. He begins with, over the decades, FreeBSD development and coordination has shifted from being purely online to involving more and more in-person coordination and cooperation. The FreeBSD Foundation sponsors a Dev Summit right before BSD Can, EuroBSDCon, and AsiaBSDCon so that developers traveling to the cons can leverage the airfare and hammer out some problems. Yes, the internet is great for coordination, but nothing beats a group of developers spending 10 minutes together to sketch on a whiteboard and figuring out exactly how to make something bulletproof. In addition to the coordination efforts, though, conference dev summits are hierarchical. There's a rigid schedule with topics decided in advance. Someone leads the session. Sessions can be highly informative, passionate arguments, or anything in between. BSD Cambridge is a little different. It's an invaluable part of the FreeBSD ecosystem. However, it's something that I wouldn't normally attend. But right now is not normal. I'm writing a new edition of Absolute FreeBSD. To my astonishment, people have to come to rely on this book when planning their deployments and operations. While I find this satisfying, it also increases the pressure on me to get things correct. When I wrote my first FreeBSD book back in 2000, wow, 17 years ago, a dozen mailing lists provided authoritative information on FreeBSD development. One person could read every one of those lists. Today, that's not possible, and the mailing lists are only one narrow aspect of the FreeBSD social system. He continues to write, don't get me wrong, it's pretty easy to find out what people are doing and how the system works, but it's not that easy to find out what people will be doing and how the system will work. If this book is going to be future-proof, I needed to leave my cozy nest and venture into the wilds of Cambridge, England. Sadly, the BSD camp chair agreed with my logic, so I boarded an aluminium commercial airliner, and found myself hurtled from Detroit to Heathrow. Yeah, this is typical Michael Lucas.
Yep. And one Wednesday morning, I made it to the William Gates building of the Cambridge University Computer Lab. Consciousness nailed to my body by a thankful infinite stream of proper British tea. BSD camp attendance is invitation only, and the facilities can only handle about 50 people or so. You need to be actively working on FreeBSD to wrangle an invite. Developers attend from all over the world, yet there's no agenda. Robert Watson is the chair, but he doesn't decide on the conference topics. He goes around the room and asks everyone to introduce themselves, say what they're working on, and declare what they would like to discuss during the conference. The topics of interest are tallied, the most popular topics get assigned time slots, and one of the two bigger rooms. Folks interested in less popular topics are invited to claim one of the small breakout rooms. Then the fun really begins. I started by eavesdropping in the virtualization workshop. For 2 hours, people discussed FreeBSD's virtualization needs, strengths, and weaknesses. What needs help? What should this interface look like? What compatibility is important and what isn't? By the end of the session, a couple dozen people had developed a reasonable consensus, and most importantly, some folks had added items to their to-do lists. Reap for a dozen more topics, and you get a good grip on what's really happening with security mitigation technologies, FreeBSD's cloud support, the TCP IP implementation, advances in teaching, and more. A BSDCan Dev Summit presentation on packaging the base system is informative, but eavesdropping on 24 highly educated engineers arguing how to nail down the final tidbits needed to make that a real thing is far more educational.
Oh, yeah.
To my surprise, I was able to provide useful feedback for some sessions. I speak at a lot of events outside of the FreeBSD world and was able to share much of what I hear at Linux conferences. A tool that works well for an experienced developer doesn't necessarily work for everyone. He says, every year I leave BSD Can tired. I left BSD Cambridge entirely exhausted. These intense, focused discussions stretched my brain. But I have a really good idea of what key parts of FreeBSD development are actually headed. That would help future-proof the new Absolute BSD or FreeBSD book as much as any computer book can be future-proof. Plus, BSD Cambridge throws the most glorious conference dinner I've ever seen. I want to thank Robert Watson for his kind invitation and the FreeBSD Foundation for helping defray the costs of this trip.
Yeah, so it was nice to have Michael there, and as you saw, it's not just engineers talking; it's everyone could contribute to these sessions, and from their experiences, pretty much bringing all their knowledge and experience. And as he wrote, the stuff he had from the Linux camps and the conferences he attends is pretty much the same input as we would get from anyone else.
This week's episode of BSD Now is brought to you by IX Systems. Head over to ixsystems.com/BSDnow and check out the ultimate guide to buying a new server for open source. You know, most other places that sell servers will try to sell you an OS or something, but they don't always understand exactly what it takes to run open source on a server and how to make that work well. Whereas IX does. You know, they've run most of the open source operating systems you can think of on the machines. And so they know what hardware actually works and how to pick the right hardware so that it's going to be the best open source machine that it can be.
Yep. Beginning from the CPU to the memory, even down to the smallest cable that needs to fit into the chassis, it's all engineered, and people that are assembling these know what they're doing and build you the server that you are going to love for the purpose you intend to buy it.
Yeah, it's all the way through. Like the Intel CPUs, they have the entire range, whether you need a little low power Atom thing or the newest, biggest Intel scalable processor. But like you said, knowing which HBA, which hard drive controller to put in it, that's going to have the best drivers for, FreeBSD or Linux or whatever you're going to run on it, makes a big difference. And then you have the burn-in testing, right? They're going to put your machine together and then work it out for a couple days and work out any kinks in it. And then you get the white glove treatment. Like when you buy the server, it's going to ship with the hard drive shipped separately in like this super duper double packed foam. Really nice. But because the hard drives were tested and they already did the work for you, it means the drives are in the anti-stack bag, but they're already in the caddy. So you don't have to spend forever putting those little screws in the drives. When you buy a machine with 36 hard drives in it, this saves a lot of time.
Oh, yeah.
You put the machine in the rack and you just plunk hard drives in instead of having to spin there and put in 144 little screws. That makes your data center trip a lot shorter. They also let you handle all the configuration, right? You fill out this form and explain how you want the machine configured, and they do all that before they ship it, which means you can safely ship it to a remote data center where you're never, ever, ever going to set foot. And they've got all to the point of like a little sticky note mentioning, plug the Ethernet cable into this port, not this port, right? Because there's maybe 4 Ethernet ports on the back of this thing. It's like, this one's the management port, and this is the one that's configured with the IP address. And as soon as all they have to do is rack the server, plug in the power in the Ethernet, and magic comes out.
Yeah.
If I bought an off-the-shelf server from some other place, it wouldn't do that. And I would waste all kinds of time and money trying to get, rack monkeys at the far end somewhere to set up the IP addresses on the server for me or something. The OS wouldn't have been installed properly either. So, I very much appreciate having IX handle all that stuff for me.
Yep. So check out ixsystems.com and tell them we sent you. Okay, it's finally time to answer your interview questions that you sent us over the weeks past. So this is the interview section with Alan and myself, as well as JT. So the way that this works is that I read the question that people have sent us. Then I answer for JT if there's a question. Then Alan answers his question, and then I continue with mine.
No, that's not how it works.
The other way around?
Kind of. Yeah. Anyway, so the first set of questions we picked out here are the ones that viewers addressed to kind of all of us, all three of us. There's still time to send in more questions, which is fine. And we'll do episodes based on questions specifically asked to me and Benedict in the future. Because we've gotten a good response and we want to answer as many of the questions as we can. So yes, you can start with the first question, and then I will proxy for JT. Sadly, I can't do his accent.
Okay. Yeah, then we'll see how this works, and people will chime into it. So the first question we got is, as a kid, what did you dream to become of as an adult?
So JT wanted to be an astronaut.
Okay.
Pretty generic, but...
Yeah. So for myself, I wanted to be a private detective. So this is all, it sounds glory and shiny, but I mean, if you're a little kid, then you have certain expectations or dreams how certain jobs work. Way back then, I read a couple of crime novels, and I always found the process of how they figure out who did the crime or the murder or whatever it is. That was the actual thing that interested me, and how they got into the research and finding these clues and all these things. That was really fascinating to me. So I could picture myself doing the same thing as a day job. Didn't work out, as people would probably know by now, but the actual process of analysis and finding these clues and analyzing them in a proper way, that is still something that I think I still retain, like in my university work or in my sysadmin job, where I'm trying to debug stuff like student programs they couldn't figure out themselves, or if there's a sysadmin problem, like a machine's not working and I need to find out why is that the case. So I also have to have a way of approaching that in a structured way. And I think that is something that I learned from this dream that I had when I was a little boy.
Yeah, I can definitely see how debugging and detracing and so on kind of really fit into that same skill set.
Yeah, and there's a post-mortem thing in a different kind of way going on sometimes. And it's tedious sometimes, but it's actually quite challenging and also satisfying if you really get to the bottom of the crime in this case, or who was the culprit, or what program misbehaved, or what caused the problem that you were analyzing.
Yeah, for me as a child, I didn't really think about it much. You know, when I was very small and people would ask me, my generic answer was like, I want to be an architect or something, but I didn't even have a concept of what that actually involved. Although I guess it turns out I kind of became a network architect, which is something. But, you know, once I got my first computer and started playing with it, I pretty much knew I was going to do something with this computer. I had no real concept of what. You know, things have changed a lot over the years. You know, I never really thought I was going to be, well, you know, at first I thought I was going to be more of a programmer. But then in high school, when I did a work placement at the power plant, I really got into networking stuff, and I found that networking and server administration stuff a lot more interesting. And then slowly things kind of skewed back the other way, where it's like, all right, I've got this network set up, but it'd be a lot easier if I could program some of the tools I use as a network administrator.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't really have a good answer. I didn't think about it that much when I was a kid.
Well, actually, for me, it's still ongoing, I guess, because you're never in your final job, I guess, because it's all, I mean, for me when I was studying in the university, everyone wanted to be a consultant when they finished and wanted to do a lot of programming, and I pretty much couldn't see myself doing that. So I was still, when I got my degree finally, I was still thinking of, now that I have this degree, what should I do? And then it pretty much just the next thing followed the other one, and then the next job came along. So I always was working in some kind of way, and I'm happy what I'm doing currently. So I think it's still a process that it's going on. And so usually our parents and their parents were usually doing the same job over the whole lifetime. And I think in this day and age, we pretty much have the flexibility to do everything for a while and then switch to another job without being necessarily in a disadvantage about this, or getting a pay degree or pay decrease or something. So there's a couple of things that could be done in the future, and I'm not sure whether I'm staying at the university forever. So it's interesting to see what's coming.
Yep. So moving on to the next question.
Yep. So the question was, how do you manage to stay organized day to day with so much things you're actively doing each day, like day job and wife, girlfriend, conferences, hobbies, friends, etc.?
So JT asks, who said I was organized?
Yeah, short and sweet. So my answer to that is, well, a lot of stuff is in my calendar as reminders. Like I have board meetings, I have other meetings at the university, of course, especially when the semester is about to start. Then I have a very rigid schedule where I cannot do many things because I have to be in a certain place at a certain time. So a lot of things are in my calendar. I also have a lot of browser tabs open as a kind of a reminder thing, or as a to read later list. So then I know, this tab reminds me of doing this or reading about that specific thing. The problem is the list grows, and as many people know, the browser tabs have only a certain number of ways to grow in a certain direction. So it's always more tabs and not closing any tabs. But yeah, it's a system that I use. It's probably not the best one in the world, but it helps me in doing these things. I have a few tips because students always struggle with this and ask me, hey, do you have any tips for like organizing yourself better, or how can I do task switching better, or some of these things that they haven't learned really in school and are now in university struggling with so many different things going on at the same time. So a few things that help me is like if I'm task switching when getting stuck helps. So if I'm working on a problem and can't seem to get anywhere, I just put this aside and start something else, because there's always something else you can do. And going back to the original question you switched back from, while doing something in the meantime, lets the brain still work on the problem, and then when you go back, you get different ideas of how to approach the problem. So this might be something for people to try out. Also, you can focus on a single goal for the day. So pick one thing you want to work on today. I know it sounds easy, but it isn't, because many people get distracted by other things. But try to solve at least one thing during the day, not 5 or 6 or even 3 or 2, just one thing. And then when that is done, then it's actually quite satisfying. But also when it's done, you can start another task. And yeah, if you want to, I get a lot of questions from students that are procrastinating or know that they're procrastinating but want to get out of that spiral. So it gets easier if you have a big task ahead, and just to chip a couple of things away from it. So like, I need to create a big presentation. So yeah, but just create the cover slide for it. Just the very first easy task. Everyone can do this. Name, date, title, that's easy. And then once they get started on the process of doing this easy thing, they also get to know or to work on the more complicated stuff that way. And that is something that I often do when I have a big task ahead of me that I'm always struggling, or most of the time struggling, because I do small things on it. And I chip away a certain thing, and then at the end, I'm pretty much done with the big mountain. And sometimes these things look more difficult than they actually are. So we often imagine this task being much more time intensive or much more complicated than we thought. And once we start, then we see, oh, this is actually quite easy, or hey, that didn't take so long as intended. So that's probably why people are so disorganized, because they cannot imagine how the actual work involved in a certain task is going to take.
Yeah. For me, I barely manage to stay organized. Again, lots of Google Calendar reminders so that my phone pings at me and so on. Also, in the office for our company, we have an entire wall that's covered in these removable whiteboard sheets. They're basically plastic cling film that sticks to the wall, and you can whiteboard on it. And it's just covered in to-do lists. Not all of them are for me, but a lot of them are for me. So that's a lot. In my browser, I use a service called pinboard.in to manage the bookmarks. Especially, I started with it when I started the previous podcast 6 or something years ago, because I wanted to bookmark stuff as I found it throughout the week and then compile it all the day before the show. And I didn't want to just clutter up my browser's bookmarks, because I use those for things I need to use on a regular basis. And these were things I was going to bookmark, come back to next week, and then never look at again. So yeah, I use that. Other tips I would say, definitely write things down. Don't trust your memory. I forget things all the time if I don't write them down. And then I have a similar kind of tip to Benedict of what I call proactive procrastination. If you really don't want to do the top thing on your to-do list, do the second thing. You say you're still procrastinating like you want to, but you're actually accomplishing something.
Mm. Yeah, it's true with the... if you have a list, then don't take... I mean, the top item is usually the most important one, but...
Right, but what you do is you make the top one something really big that's, I wouldn't say not important, but...
more scary, or...
Well, not the one with the deadline coming up. Mm. Right? It's the one that you can keep procrastinating from, and feel like you're procrastinating by not doing the big scary thing, by doing the thing that's coming up.
Oh, yeah. And writing things down is actually something that I hear from many people, like Drew Levine, for example. She wrote pretty much every command down when she started learning Unix, and that pretty much ended up into being the BSD hacks book, because that is every little cheat, every little trick she found. Or if I configure a new server or a new service that I haven't run it, so I pretty much copy and paste all the commands that I use, and then I close it down a little bit further when I know, okay, this is the command I entered then, and this brought me into this configuration file, and this is the content that I changed. But afterwards, if you have all these jumble of writings and copy and paste things, then you can find, this is the way I approach this. And then next time you start this process all over again, then you can use that as a starting point without having to, how did I do this 6 months ago? I don't know. But if you wrote it down, then it's there for you.
At our company, we have an internal wiki with a lot of stuff like that, but also with comments and explanation of why you're running this command and so on, or what this extra flag does.
Yeah, okay. Next question is, what hobbies outside of IT do you have?
So for JT, he says he loves photography. He says he does do it professionally part-time, so he's not sure if that counts as a hobby. He said beyond that, he likes working on cars in his garage. He has some old Volkswagens and stuff that he's always tinkering with.
Ooh, nice. Okay. So for me, I do Tai Chi. It's the 5th year I'm doing this now, or the 6th year. Yeah, it must have been the 6th year. So I pretty much got into this out of interest and just wanted to try it out, and then I liked it so much that I'm now doing it regularly. I used to do it 3 times per week, but now I have a little bit more at work and the show to do. I could do it on other days probably, but it's 3 times has been already a little bit too much. It was great actually, because I got a lot of stuff ahead of the class, and but I currently do it just once a week, and it's really relaxing. I can do it pretty much everywhere alone. I just need a little bit of space to move around. And that's what keeps me a little bit outside of the focus of the IT to do something completely different that's not in any way related to technology or doesn't even need electricity. In other hobbies, well, if you call it a hobby, then I did a lot of YouTube watching, probably too much that it's too good for me. Browsing the web, of course, it's still IT, but it's more like leisurely browsing to like things that are interesting to me. I did play some games before I started studying at the university, and but I made a promise to myself that I shouldn't play too much when I entered the university, because I could already see before I even started that this didn't work out well when I did playing and studying, so that the playing usually overtakes the studying, and that's what I did. And pretty much the studying was getting too much, or I did too much without playing too much, and I'm actually proud of that, because I did the promise to myself and I kept that. So gaming is pretty much, I follow it from afar and I see what games are coming out, but I have no time to play them anymore. It's with all the FreeBSD work that I'm now doing, it's a good way of keeping away from that. I know what people are talking about it and what kind of cool stuff you can do now in games, but I have no time to do this anymore. It's still fascinating to some point, and I sometimes have a fallback and play some very, very old games, but I don't even have the GPU or hardware to play the newer games anymore, and I don't have any consoles like PlayStation or something, so this is not something I'm currently interested in. And pretty much the FreeBSD stuff keeps me busy, and the nice thing about that is that it takes me to places where I would probably not travel by myself, so different countries, meeting different people. That's the interesting part for me. Pretty much all my holiday time is spent for that at the moment, and I couldn't see myself doing a regular boring holiday like 3 weeks on a beach or something. It's not something I would do. I mean, beach holidays are nice, don't get me wrong, but at some point it gets boring if you're a geek like me. So conferences are the thing that I'm relaxing at.
Yeah, for me, it's a little bit of video games. That's a couple friends and I usually play an hour or two after dinner sometime, early in the evening. Other than that, I like to ski, although I don't do that nearly as often as I would like to anymore. Yeah, and then for most of my vacation-y time, I spend that doing BSD stuff, but I don't mind that. I like that, Again, I'm not the type of person to travel a lot, which is funny because I've got 100,000 air miles on the books this year.
Yeah, how does this work out for you?
Yeah, so I was never much for traveling, but, there are the conversations in the company that I can't get anywhere else except for a BSD conference, so I go to them and I have a great time. but it's not because of necessarily where it is, you know.
It's more for the
It's
people
because of the people, and so yeah, it's almost like the whole bunch of us are a little bit of a vacation crew or something. We randomly meet each other in various countries.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not. Well, travel is nice in itself, but it has a purpose, and we have an end goal, and we want to go somewhere where other people that are in the same mindset that we are.
Yeah, you know, I wouldn't do well if I spent a week just doing absolutely nothing. I would go stir crazy. So I would much rather. This sounds weird. I'd rather spend my relaxing time getting completely spent on talking to people and working on things, and getting to just focus on that and ignore everything else. You know, that's what I like about the conference time is I can usually manage to just not think about work for the whole week.
Oh yeah. That's totally out of that world during these hours or days. Okay, next question, short and sweet. How do you relax?
JT says, what is this word relax and what does it mean?
Yeah, for me, I've answered this in the previous question already. So my Tai Chi plays a big part in it, I guess. So it's relaxing by moving around. If you haven't seen any Tai Chi before, it's very slow. It's very, it's not too slow, but it's still slow and steady, moving around. And it's not just hectic like in a fitness studio or something. So you can be pretty sweaty afterwards if you do it correctly, but it's a different kind of strain, if you even want to call it strain. It's very relaxing, and it's also calming you down a little bit. I mean, people need to sometimes run around or do a fitness studio to get your thoughts a little less racing. But for me, this is pretty much what Tai Chi does for me. It's also a way to get down a little bit and focus more on the important things in life. And outside of that is pretty much the same what everyone else does. I watch a couple of movies when I'm trying to relax, and I'm trying to get a lot of sleep. That's also very relaxing.
Yes, sleeping in is always a great one. For me, it's usually watching TVs or movies. Although lately I've taken to doing most of my TV watching on my exercise bike. So while not necessarily physically relaxing, it's definitely mentally relaxing, being able to put everything else out of my mind. And then with movies, it's usually, a bunch of my friends will either come over here and we use my little home entertainment system and watch something like the latest episode of The Grand Tour or something. Or, we go and see a couple of movies a year to see, what's out there.
Yeah. In this regard, I guess we're pretty much standard material.
Yeah, we're pretty boring people.
Yeah. Why do we even
Nothing
bother?
exciting to see here.
Okay, next up is, if FreeBSD didn't exist, which BSD flavor would you use and why?
So JT says, I use TrueOS, but if FreeBSD didn't exist, then that project probably wouldn't exist either. So my other choice would be Hardened BSD, but that's also based on FreeBSD, so in the same dilemma.
Yeah, you cannot get out of this easily. Yeah. For me, it's difficult. I mean, I once installed NetBSD to just see what it can do because at that point I was still undecided which BSD to use. I was still trying out things and just wanted to see what the other guys are doing. And if FreeBSD actually wouldn't exist, which would be, that would be a bad world, I guess. But it wouldn't. If it wouldn't, then I guess I would probably try my luck with NetBSD. OpenBSD is also appealing, but I've never actually even installed it first. So I see it on developers' laptops, and I see that they're doing good stuff with it, and it's secure and all that. But I never had any first-hand experience with it. So if it comes between NetBSD and OpenBSD, it's just for the little bit more experience that I had with NetBSD and not for any feature that they have or don't have.
Yeah. When I first started with FreeBSD in about 2000, the only other BSD I'd heard of is OpenBSD. And I think at one point somebody asked me to log into their OpenBSD box and help them configure a firewall or something. Later in college, the Unix security course was actually taught on NetBSD because that's what the professor knew. So I know a bit about it, but everything I know about NetBSD is 10 years old now. If FreeBSD wasn't around, I don't think the world would look quite like it does, especially for me. I don't know what conferences would look like, and so on. So it's pretty hard to speculate of what I would do if FreeBSD wasn't around because, the entire world would probably look a lot different. I don't think I want to know what it would look like if FreeBSD wasn't around.
We wouldn't be doing this probably, or only in a very limited fashion, I guess, where we are now. But to get even worse, the next question is, if any of the BSDs weren't around and you had to use Linux, which camp would you belong to? Red Hat, SUSE, Debian, Ubuntu, Gentoo?
Yep, so JT says, I learned Linux in the mid-90s using Slackware, which I used consistently up until the mid-2000s when I joined the Puppy Linux community and eventually became a developer. He says, FYI, Puppy is/can be based on Slackware, but it's complicated. So I'd go back to using either Slackware or Puppy Linux.
Mm-hmm. So for me, before I discovered FreeBSD, I tried various Linux distributions. The first one was probably one that isn't around anymore, so no means of mentioning it. And then I landed at Debian, and I used it pretty extensively as my desktop OS at home. So I built custom kernels and even made those into packages to install them later when I had to reinstall because I made some stupid mistakes. And then I discovered pretty much FreeBSD and ran both side by side for a few months to copy files over and learn what the other thing is doing differently. And then I pretty much discovered, one day you haven't booted the Debian system in a long, long time. So I made the switch to FreeBSD. But if FreeBSD actually wouldn't be around, then I'd probably be sticking with Debian for the time being.
Yeah, for me, when I got my first server, I had a little bake-off between FreeBSD and Slackware. And ended up picking FreeBSD. But Slackware was the first Linux that I had really played with, and it helped that it was the most BSD-like, and BSD is what I had learned a little bit about, although I was still very new at this point. But all the bits of Linux I learned in school were Red Hat 9 back then, before it was called Enterprise Linux. And so I can somewhat wrap my head around that. And that served me quite well working with various CentOS boxes and so on over the years. Although now, they've basically changed almost everything over because of systemd, and so most of the old knowledge I have is actually more harmful than useful, because I'm like, well, this is the way you used to do it, but they changed everything, so you probably don't want to do it that way. In particular, in CentOS 7, there's a lot of this kind of half-broken backwards compatibility glue, where the old way will kind of work, except for when it doesn't. And so it's actually worse than not knowing what it is. Or, I'd be better off with, if I didn't know anything about Red Hat, starting on it than knowing how to do stuff for Red Hat 9 or, CentOS in the early days. Mm-hmm. But, yeah, probably Red Hat, I guess.
Yeah. But it's still difficult to imagine what would be if BSD wouldn't be around. Okay, next up is, are you still finding yourself in need to use Windows or Mac OS, and why?
Yep, so JT says, I work part-time as a professional photographer, so I do use Windows for my photography work. While I can do everything I need to do on Linux, it comes down to being pragmatic about my time. What takes several hours to accomplish on Linux, I can accomplish in about 20 minutes on Windows.
Yeah, for me, so I was a long-time Windows user before I actually started university and before I had my first Unix experiences. But back then it was more like, Vista is coming out, and I didn't like what I was seeing in it and the features it had, and I needed a new laptop anyway. So my choice was basically learning to cope with the Vista's awful features, or to learn completely new Mac OS X, which I never used before. And then I decided to switch to Mac OS X, so I bought a Mac laptop back then, and that was in the early 2000s. And it pretty much increased my productivity because it had all the Unix commands that I was used to, and it had a lot of new shiny GUI events that I had and didn't have in Windows for a while. So it was pretty much the much better Unix desktop experiences back then. Nowadays, a little less so. So there's a lot of feature creep going on, and I use probably 20% of the whole software stack or the applications that they ship with. But if I had to use Windows, I mostly have to use it at work because we have a lot of Windows workstations and some of our labs are running Windows. So I have to kind of know where the start button is nowadays and how to slide certain windows in and all these GUI features that they now have. I manage our Windows terminal server at work, so this is pretty much all the exposure that I have to Windows nowadays. And I usually use that terminal server just to install applications on it that I use, so that I don't have to install them locally. And then I disconnect when I don't want to run it anymore, or I'm finished and I don't have to deal with virtual boxes and all that stuff.
For me, I still use Windows for playing games and a lot of video conferences. I end up using like 5 different video conferencing software at least once, every 1 or 2 weeks. And so that gets complicated outside of the mainstream OSs, especially since a couple of the people I end up video conferencing with for business stuff are using, not Google Hangouts or Skype, but, something like Zoom or other kind of very specific software. And we use Windows to produce BSD now because it's a lot easier and faster. Some of that could be done on BSD, but not as easily, or maybe, Google Hangouts just doesn't work currently. However, I have kind of promised myself that instead of switching to Windows 10, I will switch to BSD. So this machine will remain Windows 7 until that doesn't work anymore.
It falls apart.
But, I'm working on getting more and more to the BSD. And hopefully BSD will get easier and easier to do that with. But, yeah, there will probably have to be a Windows box around for quite a while. Really don't want it to be Windows 10, though. And so eventually I don't know. I've learned better than to try to predict the future, but I'm definitely avoiding things.
Yeah, Windows 10 is the same thing. I'm trying to stay away as long as I can, but yeah. Sometimes the students are, well, you don't know this about Windows? Well, I'm like, no, I'm a Unix guy. But yeah, it's unavoidable sometimes, and there are applications only for Windows, and it's difficult to port them and stuff like that. But yeah, that's the world I guess many people are living in currently, and they can't fully migrate to the BSDs or any Unix system out there. Anyway, moving on. The next question is a little bit more intense because it lets us describe our home networking setup. So describe your router type, router OS, router hardware, network segmentation, Wi-Fi apparatuses, other devices connected, and anything else that might be of interest about your home network.
Okay, so mine, JT didn't answer this question. I'm guessing he doesn't have a very exciting home network. My home network is a bit special. So my router is an E3 1220 V3. So that's dual core plus hyperthreading 3.1 gigahertz with 8 gigs of RAM and 4 Intel gigabit server NICs. And it runs vanilla FreeBSD, usually a snapshot of current of some type. So that causes occasional excitement. It has 4 different VLANs. There's one for my home, basically the upstairs of my house. One for the office, which is the basement of my house. A DMZ, which is where the servers in the rack go. I'll get to that in a second. There's the spare bedroom in the basement is a server room, and it's got a rack in it full of machines. And then there's a 4th VLAN for guest Wi-Fi with a separate SSID and a short password I can give out to people when they're visiting. Incongruously, the Wi-Fi is served by a tiny USB device about yay big, It's about half the size of a deck of cards. And it serves Wi-Fi with 3 different SSIDs, one for home, one for office, and one for guests. There are Ethernet jacks in every room in the house that are wired for 10 gigabit, although the only machines actually having 10 gigabit interfaces are this machine here, which is one of my workstations, the FreeBSD file server in the basement, and a couple of the ZFS storage servers. There are 3 switches, one in the laundry room, which is the one that's wired to the jacks all over the house, one in the rack, which is where all the servers and stuff connect to, and then there's a 10 gig switch in the rack as well, which is where the few 10 gig machines are wired to. And then there's a rack in my basement in the spare bedroom there, so that I can close the door and it keeps all the white noise in, and it has a separate air conditioning setup. There are 7 servers there, mostly used to store live replicas of our customer data for Scale Engine. So when we store recordings or uploaded video on demand content for people, the backups of it basically live in a rack in my basement, so that if something were to go wrong, those machines can be pulled out of that rack and driven to a data center and installed if need be, or we have almost enough internet here to run stuff temporarily from my basement if need be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yours is way more advanced or special than mine. Mine is pretty simple home network. It's an Apple Express base station. It's a couple of years old, actually, so I might need to replace it at one point. And it's an AVM Fritzbox for the whole DNS, DHCP. It's a all-in-one solution. You just click the GUI things you need to configure in there, and that's pretty much all set and gets your network running. From there, I have a very long network cable to my desktop machine. It's pretty much half of the floor that I'm sitting on. And that's my desktop machine, but even that I'm using less and less often. So I just bought a Raspberry Pi 3 for some home use, and may have to use this probably in the future exclusively. So let's see how this works out. I hope I use it much more than I use the current one. And my brother's Wi-Fi, or he manages that mostly. His MacBook is on it, my MacBook is on it, and our mother's iPad, and that's pretty much all the users that we have. So it's not Alan's big IT-like or server room-like setup. It's a home network, nothing else. Okay, that was the technical question, I guess, with more details. The next one is, how do you guys manage to get your work done on FreeBSD desktops? What do you do when you need a Linux or a Windows app that doesn't or hasn't been ported yet or is working? I've made several attempts to switch to FreeBSD, but each attempt failed because of tools not being available, like Zoom, Dropbox, TeamViewer, CrashPlan, or are broken, like VirtualBox.
Yeah, so generally I don't need that many of those apps. In my case, I have many computers, and so I can always use a Windows one if need be, basically. Zoom is one of the examples of the video conferencing software that I use Windows for. But for most of my usage, especially like, if I'm at a conference, I can manage on my FreeBSD laptop because it's, Firefox, Thunderbird, an SSH client, Quazzle, the IRC client, Komodo Edit as a text editor, and maybe a couple other apps. But, my needs are pretty basic in that case. Not very demanding at all. It is annoying when packages are broken every once in a while. I think it was Firefox wasn't building for a couple days because of a problem with an update to SQLite. I usually work around this with boot environments, being able to just go back to a working version from a couple days ago and to hold out for the couple of days until it's fixed. Usually it's not that big of a problem. And, I do have access to Windows machines for the odd time where I need, specific VPN software or, something to run Java or something of that nature for, the Dell or HP out-of-band management tools for servers and so on.
Yep. So if I had a need for a Windows application, I mostly have to use it at work in the university. So I use VirtualBox for everything that is not natively available or Windows only. So unfortunately, that pretty much means no modern games because trying to emulate those or virtualize those is pretty much going nowhere. So I mostly do work in the shell when I'm on FreeBSD, and when it has to be a graphical application, I use Fluxbox as the desktop environment. I want to get work done, actually, not look at fancy eye candy that Windows has or some other applications use, because that's getting boring after a while. I even deactivated all of the stuff on my Mac for the same reason. And when I look for alternative software online, then I use just Google and the name of the software and then hit alternatives afterwards. And usually you'll find a certain project on GitHub or another application that roughly does the same. But my needs, again, are relatively easy to satisfy, as I'm not doing any video editing or rendering of some videos that I'm doing. So my needs are currently mostly text editing and having a web browser and a way to connect to other machines via SSH, and that pretty much solves all my needs for the Windows. Okay, we hit that spot already, but this question is about desktop environments and is asking us what are our favorite ones and why. So, for example, the question submitter likes i3, XFCE, and is drawn to Lumina's ethos, but as far always seems to end up back on XFC because of its ease of use, flexibility, and dashing good looks.
Yeah, so JT says, as a Lumina desktop developer, I think my preference is obvious, but he's also a longtime OpenBox user, and so he has a soft place in his heart for that as well.
Mm-hmm. So for me, I use Fluxbox, as I say, and because it doesn't have any shiny things that you just need to have a little, menu to open things, and then usually you just start a shell or a little browser and then work from there. But if I want to have a lot of windows or an application demands X11, then I use that. And so KDE and others like GNOME or bigger ones are too memory heavy for me, and I rarely use even 20% of the features they provide. So that's my use case.
Yeah, for me, when I started, I was a longtime KDE user, mostly because I've been coming from Windows, so having the buttons be in the same place was easier to deal with. But lately, I've adopted Lumina. In general, I don't want glitz and glamour and so on my desktop. I just want it to get out of the way and let me do my work. Early on, Lumina had a couple of annoyances, but I basically managed to nag the developers until it does what I want. Having BSD native applications in a bunch of that helps a lot, because it means that they're going to keep working. Like the Lumina PDF viewer, I've had quite a few tweaks done to that for me, and it works very nicely now. I'm very happy with it.
Okay.
Almost done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is more for the shell people. They asked, which command line shells do you prefer? Why and how, if at all, have you customized the environment or prompt? So mostly for the servers that I run at the university, I don't bother with installing any extra shells. So I use the ones that are on the system already. And for the system that are requiring LDAP, well, they have the shell hard-coded into it, which is Bash. So I have to use that one. It's pretty much the same. For me, I don't use that much. But for my private use, I use the Z shell, but without all the fancy stuff like, my Z shell or all the other scripts that are out there, because mostly people just download them without understanding what the thing does internally or what other changes are being made there. So I just want to get something simple that works, but still powerful enough for my needs. And this is what makes me productive. I try to keep things simple. I'm slowly getting into Tmux and want to work in it in the future, mostly because then I have the way to detach windows and split up the screen, what Tmux is and what it does. So at conference, I'm usually looking at, I get a glance of people's laptops, and I'm seeing people having all these crazy kind of things going on, and multiple windows, and up in the left corner there's a compiler running, in the lower left there's a browser, in the lower down right corner there's something else going on, and it's kind of fascinating what kind of environments people are working in nowadays. So maybe this is something I'm going to do more in the future if I have the time to work on it. I have pretty much a simple prompt like user at hostname, and then on the right side I have the time and the date, and I put the way to do the same in your Z shell RC into the show notes, so you can replicate that same environment. It's not very fancy, but for people who want to have the same, then it's in there.
Yeah, for me, I started with TCSH early on. It was on the first shells account that I had, and so I kind of stuck with that, especially because when I got my copy of BSD hacks, it showed me how to enable typo correction for TCSH. So when you do, something pipe grep blah, and you held shift a bit too long and spelled grep with a capital G, it's like, did you mean grep with a lowercase g? And you say yes, and then it fixes it for you, and it's the most amazing thing ever. And a bunch of things like that. And yeah, my shell prompt is very basic: username at host and the path. But the path is never shortened to just tilde for the home directory. I like the whole path. I've seen some other shell prompts. Mostly, I like it kind of small. The chat room says, if only TCSH was better at scripting. It's like, well, you can write C shell scripts, but you shouldn't.
Yeah.
So next question.
Personal preferences for people. Yeah, next one is, what is one thing or more missing in FreeBSD you would import from another project or community? Would be tech, process, etc.
So JT would like AUFS from Linux, which is an overlay file system, which is mostly the basis of that puppy Linux thing he worked on before, but is quite interesting. It would be nice if some of the overlays things like we had in FreeBSD worked better, or if we got something that did work.
So for me, I know where we were when this came up. So we were at BSDCan and we were discussing some of the things with no hang up.
The first time this came up was at the very first VBSDCon.
That was before my time at BSDCon.
2014. And I think, yes, we talked about it at BSDCan every year after that.
Then you referenced that. Okay. So for me, I heard about this, and so this is pretty much no hang up, as people know from the Unix shell. So the use case there is that if you run a program and then you are like, oh, I need my shell back, so I need to detach that program somewhere without putting it in the background. So apparently in Ilomos, the no hang up program has a switch or a functionality built into it so that you can put processes that are already running into the background with a no hang up after the fact. So Matt Ahrens has this apparently, or talked about it in BSDCan when we came up with that topic. It's a side topic. We didn't have it in a big session or something. It was during the breaks. And but having something like that, it would be useful, because oftentimes I run something, then I forget, and I'm always not in Tmux yet. So I'm like, I now have this shell blocked like forever, or for at least a couple of hours. And with that functionality, I could pretty much put this thing in the background and continue working on the same shell session.
Yeah, so basically it lets you retroactively run it as if you had no-huffed it in the first place. Yes.
It's small things like that.
I think it used a debugging interface we don't have on FreeBSD, but building something the same would be great. So must look at that someday. For me, I would say zones, which are basically an extension and more complete set of jails that Illumos has. So I don't know if it would necessarily be importing that as much as building out FreeBSD jails to be as good or better, but yeah, that's one more thing I wish we had.
Mm-hmm. Yep, but yeah, it's not something that's totally out of the way of being impossible.
Yep.
It can all be doable. Next question is, how do you manage your time to learn about and work on FreeBSD? Does your work or employment enable you to do this, or are your contributions mainly done in private time?
So JT says, these days I'm mostly learning things I need for work, so it just falls into something I'm doing while working on work projects. He's been working on Lumina stuff lately, and so has had to learn a bunch of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, well, basically I have a lot of time during the semester holidays, less so during the semester where I'm running around and helping students and administering the cluster. But during the semester holidays, it's pretty much everyone's away. Students aren't there, professors aren't there, so we employees are on our own most of the time. So this is the time for me to not only update my stuff, my servers and my slides, but also to learn new stuff and to go to conferences, by the way. And I think for me, this is part of the idea of being in a university, to keep yourself, updated what's going on and what people are currently working on and what the research topics are and things like that. So for me, this is an important thing to do, especially since we're working in IT, which is moving very fast sometimes. It's probably difficult or different in other faculties where there's less of a rapid process of development. But in IT, it's pretty much mandatory to keep yourself updated with the latest stuff. I also read a lot in my free time about all things Unix and BSD and things that interest me. And but my interests can shift actually sometimes rather rapidly. But if I found a topic, then I devour everything on it, like the whole internet. I have even more browser tabs than open, and then really grind my teeth into a topic to know everything about it. And then, this can be a little bit excessive, but has gotten me pretty much where I am now. This is the way I learned the Unix way and how to work with Unix to be, proficient enough to be teaching it to other people. And this is actually the way I still doing it and want to do it. And since I work with FreeBSD at work, with my own doing sometimes, I can try out many things that I read in the books or in tutorials or how-tos, and then I see that it's working, and then from there I move on and keep the things that interest me going and maybe create a conference talk out of these. So this is pretty much an ongoing process each time.
Yeah, my work means spending a lot of time working with FreeBSD, but not necessarily on FreeBSD. There may be one or two features that, most of the time we don't change FreeBSD at all. But if we do develop one or two features, we do upstream them. And so maybe a little bit of my time goes that way. But in general, my contributions are mostly done outside of work in my own time. Although, because I own part of the company that I work for, I have more flexibility to, say, take time off and go to FreeBSD-related events or, duck out for the core conference call or the Capsicum conference call and so on. I have a lot more flexibility with my schedule to get away with things like that. But my day job doesn't really result in much in the way of contributions to FreeBSD directly.
Yeah. So yeah, if we both had a typical 9-to-5 job at a company, at like a certain desk job, and this is pretty much where we wouldn't be able to do all this travel and all this conferences and contribution to FreeBSD.
The show would be difficult. Like, I guess for you, we're doing it late in the evening, but for me, it's the middle of the afternoon here.
Yeah. Yeah, we're pretty lucky in that regard. I mean, it has its pros and cons, but overall, we can't complain, I guess. So next question is, we know we can bribe Michael W. Lucas with gelato. Well, good gelato, that is. But what can we use to bribe you guys? Like when I want to have Alan to work on fixing a bug which prevents me from running ZFS on this fancy ROC64 board. So, yeah, you go first.
So I'm probably not the right person to look at your ROC64 board. I've done a little bit of ZFS stuff, but definitely not in that area, and definitely not anything ARM64. Although I'm guessing the problem is not ZFS specific. Most people in the project have taken to bribing me with chocolate. I've been to Belgium and got some stuff, but I've had the Polish people have been bribing me with these. It's working quite effectively. But in general, my to-do list is currently so long that the best way to bribe me to do something is to make a trade. You take one of the items from my to-do list and do it for me, and I will do the thing for you.
Yep. Well, for me, since I'm working in public service, there's this whole kind of, you cannot take any kinds of gifts or whatever you want to call it, bribes or other things. But project-wise or FreeBSD-wise, it's pretty much, well, the work for the foundation is pretty much not paid anyway. So it's all labor of love, I guess. And but if we are at conferences and we go out for dinner or having some other lunch, then I'm pretty much the one standing at the dessert table and taking second desserts or something. So this is what I like. This is what I do. My dentist likes me very much this way, and this is what you can get me interested in. Like, get a couple of chocolate desserts or an ice cream or something, and then you pretty much made me happy. Okay, next question up is your daily mobile device, the iOS, Android, Windows Mobile, or other, and why?
Yes, so JT says these days I'm using he's using Android on a BlackBerry Preve, but until recently it was still a heavy user of Sailfish OS. I would use Sailfish OS every day if I could find a phone with a keyboard that I could actually run it on.
Yep. So for me, it's, since I got my first smartphone, it has been iOS or the iPhone in general. I never used an Android phone. I saw it with colleagues and other friends of mine that they're using these, and they have some interesting features that the iOS don't have or probably never have, the iPhones of this world. But what drives me away are the infrequent security updates, if there are any updates at all, that keep me away from it, because you can pretty much open news every week to see one kind of Android vulnerability. I know this is big hot topic for discussion, and people are saying, no, it's gotten better and all this. But for me, I just want to get something that's working and that's secure enough. I guess there's also security holes in iOS. I'm not denying those. So, but it's the phone I use. I'm currently comfortable with, and it does what it should do.
Yep. I have a Google Nexus 6. It's running Android 7.1, so it means it has security patch from August 5th. So it's only 10 days out of date. So that is the latest security fix. So I've been getting those, although for a little while there was a lag. There was no updates for 7.0 until 7.1 finally came out for my device. In general, I picked it because I wanted the pure Android experience without, a Samsung or something modifications to it, and because it tends to gate the security updates. And I was happy with my previous phone, which was a Nexus S. I don't run any custom ROMs or OS or anything like that on my device because I need the, average user's experience to do video streaming testing stuff for work. Currently, I'm kind of displeased with the fact that support for my device will be ending soon. So I will get another couple of monthly security updates, and then that's it. And it seems kind of arbitrary and rude, honestly. I'm not sure what device I will get next, but it probably wouldn't be an iPhone.
That's it. Yeah, for this week at least. We have a bunch more.
That's been 55 minutes of answering questions. So that's about all we have time for today. We still have more questions, which we'll get to in future weeks, but do send us more questions as well, though. We'd like to answer all that.
Yep, keep them coming.
Yep. And we'd also like to thank our sponsor this week, DigitalOcean. Head over to digitalocean.com, and when you sign up, use the coupon code FreeBSD now, and it'll add $10 to your account. And it turns out you don't have to spend that $10 just on droplets. You can get other things. They have a block storage feature now, where you can get anywhere from 1 gig to 16 terabytes of storage for just 10 cents a month or 1.5 cents an hour. And then you just select the amount of storage you need, and you get exactly whenever you need.
Yep.
And then you attach it to a droplet and use it as you will. They also have lots of networking features, including load balancers, cloud firewalls, floating IP addresses, monitoring. The team accounts feature is super helpful. Use that to let multiple people have access to the account without access to the billing. I recently got Joseph Marone to do a port of doctl, which is the command line tool for the API. Makes it super easy to deal with lots of droplets from the command line. They got their 4.9s SLA, DNS management. You can get locations all over the world, and they have 24/7 tech support. Doesn't really leave much to be desired.
Yep. Or if you're multiple people working on the same VM, then you can create a team to work better with your virtual machine. So you can have one account with multiple teams, and you can set permissions for them, like whether they should be able to see the billing for that droplet, or manage a certain security kind of feature that you could have. Should they be able to edit the firewall rules, for example? All this thing is done on the DigitalOcean cloud in a very easy-to-use manner, and it's all very component-based, so you can put stuff together that should work together, or just leave it out if you don't need it, and you only pay for the stuff that you're using. So after this interview section, it's time for our news roundup this week. The first one is a beta update request for more testing. So we had this in a couple of shows earlier about the Undeadly website being a little bit updated, refreshed, and this is an update for this one.
Yes. So they've updated beta.undeadly.org, and they would like if people could go through and give it another test. The most significant change include the site now given a less antique look, as the topic icons have been eliminated and there's no longer seeking help with graphics. The site now uses a moderate amount of semantic HTML5 so that it's easier to parse. Several bugs in the HTML fragment validator used for submission and comments have been fixed. And to avoid generating invalid HTML, submission content which fails validation is no longer displayed in submission/comment preview, so that you can't inject stuff or break the whole website. Plain text submissions are converted to HTML in a more useful fashion. Instead of just converting each end of line into a line break, the converter now generates proper paragraphs and interprets 2 or more consecutive end of lines as a paragraph break. The redevelopment remains a work in progress, and thanks to everyone who's contributed. As before, constructive feedback would be appreciated. Particular interests are reports of bugs in behavior, for example, in the HTML validator or in the authentication system, that would preclude the adoption of the current code on the main site.
So send any feedback you have, and the more feedback they get, even good ones, is making the final product better, and we look forward to that one.
Yep.
Oh, great. Next up is high process count support added to DragonflyBSD. So this is another mailing list post by Matthew Dillon. And he writes, we fixed a number of bottlenecks that can develop when the number of user processes runs into the tens of thousands or higher. So one thing led to another, and I said to myself, gee, we need a 6-digit PID. Might as well make it work to 1 million. With the commits made today, master can support at least 900,000 processes with just a current.maxproc setting in /boot/loader.conf, assuming the machine has the memory to handle it. And in fact, as today's machines start to ratchet up there in both memory capacity and core count, with fast storage like NVMe and fast networking like the Gen 10 gigabit Ethernets and higher, even in consumer boxes, this is actually something that one might want to do. With AMD's Threadripper and EPIC chips now out, the Intel and AMD CPU wars are back on. Boasting up to 32 cores with 64 threads per socket and 2 sockets on EPIC, terabytes of RAM and motherboards with dual 10 gigabit Ethernet built in, the reality of these numbers are already achievable in a useful manner. In any case, I've tested these changes on a dual socket Xeon. I can in fact start 900,000 processes. They don't get a whole lot of CPU, and running PS would be painful, but it works and the system is still responsive from the shell with all of that going on. So we have a little output here with an uptime statement, and you can see that the load averages are a little bit unusual.
The load average is 890,000.
If you discover this in your server machines, you definitely have a bad day as a sysadmin. But in fact, judging from the memory use, he writes, these minimal test processes only eat around 60 kilobytes each. 900,000 of them ate only 55 gigabytes on a 128 gigabytes machine. So even 1 million processes is not out of the question, depending on the CPU requirements for those processes. Today's modern machines can be stuffed with enormous amounts of memory. Of course, our PIDs are currently limited to 6 digits, so 1 million is kind of the upper limit to terms of discrete user processes versus pthreads, which are less restricted. And he'd rather not go to 7 digits yet.
Yeah, I don't think we should have a need for 7 digits.
To be future-proof, maybe, but it's probably a little while until we have this big of processing memory power.
Yeah, more applications are going towards using threads than separate processes anyway. So, I definitely can see the value of having the large numbers of threads for things like Varnish and for the Java app we use for video streaming. But having huge numbers of separate processes is less useful currently.
Yeah.
But this next one is good news.
Oh, yeah. It's a call for testing, a driver for generic Microsoft Windows 7, 8, and 10 compatible USB human interface device multi-touch touchscreen.
Yeah, so it says, the following patch adds support for generic Microsoft Windows 7, 8, 10 compatible touchscreens via the EVDev protocol. It is intended to be a native replacement for the HID- multi-touch driver found in Linux distributions and for the webcam port. The patch is made for 12 current, and most probably can be applied to a recent 11 stable or maybe even 11.1 release, although that's not been tested yet. If you want to try it out, starting with a source checkout of current, apply the patch, compile this driver into the kernel by placing the following couple of lines into the kernel, build in support for the WMT, USB, and EVDev, or you can actually load it as a kernel module instead. Install the EVDev X11 driver and tell Xorg to use EVDev or libinput for the device instead of its own. And there you go. Note that currently the driver does not support pens or touchpads. The WMT.ko should be KLD loaded before the UHID driver to take precedence over it. Otherwise, UHID can be KLD unloaded after loading the WMT driver. And they also link to the code review if you want to look at the source code and make comments about it. And they have a link to download the raw diff.
Okay, exciting. This is something we should definitely have because many screens are multi-touch anyway, and having this in the tree is something people want to use in their X11 or whatever.
Well, it's nice to have a generic interface for it so that pretty much any touchscreen that works with Windows will work instead of having to have, a driver for every different type of touchscreen because there's just too many of them.
So it's time for our BSD bits this week. The first one that we have is BSD Mac programming language infographic. So this is on bsdmac.org, and we have a nice infographic overview of how programming languages evolved over the years, starting at 1843 with Ada Lovelace, credited with first computer programming language ever. She wrote an algorithm for the analytical engine, the early mechanical computer, and then the pretty much programming languages came after those. So there's the TOB index, which is an indicator of the popularity of various languages, and you can see how they evolve over the years and what kind of language is currently the most popular ones. And there's some ups and downs there, but there are the usual suspects in there: the Javas, the C++, the Objective-C, the Rubys, the Perls of this world.
Yeah.
And yeah.
They also have a little bit of the history on programming languages. Interesting, like looking at Fortran and Lisp and COBOL and then Pascal, and with some examples of what use it. Like apparently Skype was written in Pascal. C is obviously Unix. C++ is used in Adobe and Chrome. Objective-C is used on Apple. Perl powers some websites you might be familiar with, like IMDb and Amazon. Python is used at Yahoo and Google and so on. Ruby is used for Groupon and Hulu. Java is used on Android. PHP is used for Facebook and WordPress and so on. And then JavaScript is used for Gmail and Firefox and a bunch of other things.
That's a good overview of what is out there and how popular it is and the features. And
they have an interesting vulnerability distribution by language. The biggest problem with Java code is usually the code quality or cross, injections and so on. Whereas with C++, it's usually the error handling that they don't get right for buffer management. You see that the different languages expose different weaknesses.
Yeah, this is something people should look for, or I could see it used in teaching as well, for like comparing operating system languages, programming, and stuff like that. Okay, next up is a T2K17 hackathon report by Bob Beck on buffer cache tweaks, LibreSSL, and pledge progress.
Yeah, so this is a first report from the Toronto hackathon that just ended. It says, unusually, I had basically nothing to do with organizing the event this year. You let KRW do that. I did a few things in Toronto, a little bit of buffer cache tweaking and optimization, but most of the first half I spent sitting with Jay Singh, B. Cook, and Doug at finishing up something that Joel had started in the Edmonton hackathon a couple of months ago, rewriting all of the TLS extension handling in LibreSSL. I foolishly chose to tackle the OCSP extension, which in some respects is a bit stranger than others, but I managed to get it done while reviewing bunches of diffs from other people. The latter half of the hackathon, I spent writing something for Pledge with some design chats with Theo. Basically, the past few hackathons, I've taken a stab at helping Theo make Pledge paths usable. And while past efforts have been successful in that they work, they haven't been in that the path checking costs are borne by other processes from the one that's actually doing the pledging. We're trying another approach now to separate out the pledge path as a distinct system call and effectively front load the path costs, keeping the vnode references around for the check in pledge processes. I'm starting to test that on the airplane, but it will be a bit more before anything like that is working. And they say thank you very much to the University of Toronto for hosting and KRW for organizing.
Oh yeah, I think we'll get a couple more reports from that hackathon as the time progresses, and we'll cover this in the show, of course. But it seems like a very productive hackathon, and OpenBSD people can look forward to the features that they get from that. There's also a new FreeBSD Journal out. So the FreeBSD Journal is a publication on the FreeBSD Foundation's website and in cooperation with the FreeBSD Foundation to get people updated on what's happening in FreeBSD. And each issue has a topic. In this specific case, it's resource control. So we have a couple of articles. We like getting started with IOHive or understanding Docker. And there's also an interview with me that I did with Joe Maloney of IX Systems, because they have a couple of exciting things to talk about their OpenRC integration that they're doing, to have a similar systemd-like, but with more compelling features than systemd has probably. So he's talking about that and how far they progressed already with that. Also, there are the usual columns in there, like the conference report. We have an SVN update and new phases of FreeBSD, as well as an events calendar. So there's something in there to appeal the masses, I guess, for people interested in that. And then
Wheel Systems has an article about their Lynx network traffic analysis appliance, which is quite interesting. Mostly about how they got FreeBSD to be able to handle huge amounts of traffic and doing SSL on it.
Yep. So the FreeBSD Journal is a bi-monthly appearing issue, and you can get a browser-based edition or one for your Kindle, iPad, or other reading device.
Yep.
All right. And last but not least is NetBSD machines at the Open Source Conference 2017 in Kyoto. So the NetBSD folks in Japan are busy as always. So the message goes in the NetBSD mail index. Japan NetBSD users group members held booth at the Open Source Conference 2017 in Kyoto, August 4th to the 5th of 2017. And there's a couple of links there for the Facebook events that I did. They have a couple of pictures and screenshots on Twitter, as well as a couple of cool hardware.
Yeah, what I would like to see, one of those pictures one time, is them getting the stuff there. Like, some of these machines are awfully large, so I'm like picturing them carrying these around on the subway in Japan or something, and I think that would be humorous to look at. But yeah, they had a Luna dual PSG machine, some a Luna Z80 subprocessor, a PC 6001 data recorder, some Raspberry Pi demos, Raspberry Pi 0W, Raspberry Pi, Pi 2, and Pi 3. Lots of other stuff.
Well, there's a lot of links there to click and see what cool devices they had. And, well, this is very nice.
Mm-hmm.
What also is nice is if you are doing backups, and you should do it properly, because why not? Then you should check out tarsnap.com, which is our sponsor for the feedback and question section for the next episode, or the episode that's currently following.
Yep. And, if you want to make it even easier, check out the new Tarsnap GUI, which makes it even easier to do everything. But, if you're comfortable with using tar on the command line, you can handle the Tarsnap command line. It's that easy. But, a nice graphical tool makes it nice as well. So whichever way you prefer, either way, your data is segmented, deduplicated, hashed, and compressed, then encrypted and signed with a key that never leaves your computer, and then it goes out to the cloud where it's stored, where you can always fetch it and get it back. But you know that nobody else can decrypt it because you have the only key. So don't lose that key.
Yeah, it's the only one out there. Yeah, and Tarsnap makes it easy to manage your backups and retrieve them if you need them, and it's securely stored, and the infrastructure is actually quite well engineered by Colin Percival.
But you don't have to trust that they're storing your data safely because it's encrypted. So even if, Amazon's snooping at it, or, some government is snooping at it, there's nothing they can get from it because it's encrypted on your machine before it left your machine. So as long as your machine is fine, you don't have to worry about the Tarsnap side of it. You don't have to trust Colin. You can trust Colin, but you don't have to. That's the point.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get on to the questions.
So our first question is from Dan about an HDD question about how to manage that. So he writes, I was listening to BSD Now and you talk about ZFS and I have a question for you. I have a 1 terabyte SSD with 200 gigs of data on it and it's 1/5 full. Does this make sense to you?
Yes.
Hold on. Yeah, okay, hold on. Why not store 5 copies of everything? Why is having a drive with only 1 copy of files that is mostly empty, such as Sacred Cow? So he was thinking that it makes sense to fill the drive with duplicates at the operating system level. So a drive might start at 1/10 full with 10 copies of all files, then drop to 5 copies of everything, to 3 copies of everything, to 2 copies, then to 1 copy. What about fragmentation?
Okay, so before we get to the fragmentation question, the first couple of problems with that. The first one is performance. You don't want to wait while it makes all 10 copies of it. Also, with an SSD, it has wear level. Basically, the SSD wears out eventually. It can only write each cell so many times. So writing 10 or 20 copies of a file, the first file you write on it, is a waste of time. Right? The drive can only write so much at once and can only write so many times. So doing it excessively is going to make things worse. So if you want to do it 3 times, you can do that in ZFS, but the limit is 3 times because that's how much room there is in the block pointer to store the addresses. There is room for 3 addresses. But yeah, the main reason is it would kill the performance and it would kill the drive.
Yeah, and you don't want to wait to because the applications usually get an acknowledgement from the underlying drive when the write has been finished, if it's asynchronous.
Right.
Or
You don't want to have to wait for all 10 of those to finish.
Yeah, then you pretty much have no good user experiences anymore, because you have to wait for the applications to finish all these writes. But he continues with, what about fragmentation? Well, thought about that too. You could either over-allocate and assume that future copies of files would be larger than existing copies, or you could look at file sizes as a means of picking what should be overwritten. For instance, I could have 4 copies of a movie of 4 gigabytes each. You could allocate 4.2 gigabytes per copy. And when I need to upload a very high resolution copy of the same movie, you could replace them with 2 copies of 4.2 times 2 each.
The space management doesn't really work that way, and that's not a great way to do it, because the movie file is likely never to change. And so you would have wasted that 0.2 gigs for each copy.
Yeah. Or, he writes, if you had the same 4 copies of a 4 gig movie and upload a new movie, I could replace 2 of those with the new movie. But that's saying you always fit those boundaries, and most video files are not that. They don't fit in the holes very properly. You could maybe hide these from the OS, he writes, so that if you could get cryptoware, they would remain intact. Or simply allow a reversion back to previous copy. Anyway, so why is keeping empty space so important? Seems like you don't need to.
It's mostly the performance cost of filling it up. But you can use copies equals and have up to 3 copies of files in ZFS, but it doesn't do automatic revision control that way. Although you'd have snapshots which allow you to do that, and you end up with 3 copies of any change blocks. But yeah, it doesn't quite work that way. If it wasn't an SSD, it wouldn't be quite as bad as far as that's going to just wear out the drive a lot faster. But yeah.
Yeah, you probably need to look up a little bit more about how drives work or how file systems are implemented, and then
So ZFS can do the copies, but dynamically changing it would be complicated, and mostly I think it's because that's not what most users would want. And especially with ZFS, there's a cost every time you want to find free space. So having a bunch that's free and it's free is good. Whereas if you have to go and be like, okay, we have to note that that 4th copy of that movie isn't a copy of that movie anymore before we can overwrite it with a different movie, that's going to make writing the second movie slower.
Yeah. You still have to remember the disk is pretty much the slowest component in the whole I/O architecture on your computer, even if it's a fast SSD. Yeah, I hope we answered your question there. So we get to our next question from Benjamin about the scrub of death. We had this a couple of episodes before, but he writes, this is based on his understanding. So he lists a blog about the ZFS and non-ECC RAM kill your data. We had covered a couple of weeks ago. You link to glosses over several fine points about ECC and ZFS. First, Matthew Aaron stated ZFS is fine without ECC. And he quotes, if you enable the unsupported ZFS _debug _modify flag, and this will checksum the data while at rest in memory, unquote.
I've never heard of that before. Matt Aaron has specifically said that it's fine even without that, but if you want to checksum it, then sure, you can enable that.
Yeah, if it helps. Maybe it's a Linux-only thing. ZFS on Linux?
I don't know. Anyway, going forward.
Okay, 2. Second point. Without checksumming the data in memory, which is by default off and unsupported, ZFS is free to write out the bad data to the pool because it thinks the pool is wrong. ZFS
hold on. So that's not how that works, though. Like if new data comes in and gets corrupted, ZFS might write it out like that, depending on when it got corrupted, either with or without the right checksum. And then if it's with the wrong checksum, it'll be detected later. But like in general, ZFS is not going to have some stuff in memory that is randomly comparing to the pool. So it's not just going to start writing stuff out.
Yeah, there's a false assumption here, or how it works.
Like Matt Aarons said in the one we read from the other week, if the memory in your system is so corrupt that it's corrupting on a massive scale like this, it's going to crash the OS before ZFS has a chance to do anything.
Yeah, before it reaches the file system in the first place.
Yeah.
Then the OS first panicking.
Yeah, it's going to break something else before the file system has time to scribble over your whole drive or something. So yes, some data could get corrupted, but the same chance of that happening with any other file system. So you're at no more risk than you were if you were using, UFS or XFS or EXTFS or whatever.
So third point, he writes, not using ECC is fine because ZFS will eventually detect the data is corrupt and you can just restore from backup. I forget which co-founder said this, but you can feel the sarcastic warning. And
it's not a sarcastic warning. It's if you have a laptop, then that's how it works, right? The point is ZFS will detect that something is wrong most times, where other file systems have no way to know, so they will never detect it. So even sometimes detecting it is an improvement.
Yeah.
So if you don't have ECC RAM, then why don't you at least get sometimes? Again, the argument here is not that you should not use ECC. It's that if you're building a ZFS machine specifically to be ZFS, then yes, get ECC RAM. If it's your laptop and you can't get ECC RAM, the argument is don't not use ZFS just because you don't have ECC RAM. ECC is always better, but ZFS is without ECC is still better than something else.
Yeah. So the article linked up there in the question he writes, this article completely glosses over all of those warnings and just says ZFS is fine without ECC as a simplistic and dangerous summary. Yes, ZFS will eventually detect the corruption caused by not having ECC, but there is a real chance of it destroying everything before this happens. Okay, Pray you have a backup.
The everything is the problem there. How is ZFS going to destroy everything? It's not going to overwrite blocks that you didn't modify.
Yeah,
right? It's not going to just randomly go scribbling all over your hard drive.
Yeah.
So yes, it might corrupt a little bit of data, but if you're using something other than ZFS because you don't have ECC RAM and you can't have ECC RAM, it would do the same thing.
Yeah, it would continue to write bad data and you wouldn't notice until the application crashes.
Because ZFS is copy on write, it's less likely to overwrite the good copy of the data than an overwriting file system, which is definitely going to do it.
Yeah. So again, based on his understanding, nearly every part of the system that he uses has ECC, FEC, and parity. Kind of odd that the most important part of the system so happens to be the most sensitive to corruption, has nothing. Nearly all data that gets to the CPU is via the memory, no matter where it comes from. It is the gatekeeper for all data moving in and out of the CPU, and having zero protection is just asking for trouble. I'm ignoring certain aspects of DMA, but there is a lot of cross-device I/O buffering in memory.
Yeah, so again, the point is, if you're building a machine to do ZFS, build it with ECC. If you can get ECC, ECC is better. But if it's your laptop that you're buying and it's not possible to have ECC, you should still use ZFS because it's still better than using something other than ZFS. We're not suggesting that anybody go build a file server without ECC. We're just saying, ZFS without ECC is still better than other file systems. ZFS with ECC is still the best. Always the best.
I mean, we can always talk about this and try to convince people, but ultimately people have to try this out for themselves and see how far they get with other than ZFS file system and ZFS.
Yeah.
And I guess they will stick with ZFS. But yeah, hopefully that answers your questions about this one. Next up is Jason with a router opinion he's asking of us. So he asks, you might already know this, but there is a lot of cheap router hardware available from Alibaba and Amazon. Specifically, I would want your opinion on the J1900 quad-core Intel Quad NIC barebone to run a proper pfSense firewall with VPN. Internet speed is about 200 megabits per second, and an OpenVPN connection that will at least put 100 megabits per second through would be great. So he has 2 links to Amazon, and yeah, those are the devices.
I've never used one of these, so I don't know exactly what it's going to be able to do as far as CPU. But an x86 Atom at 2 gigahertz, I would expect you'd be able to manage. The 200 megabits of internet is definitely no problem. I think the OpenVPN will be fine. I don't know if that device is new enough to have AES-NI, but I kind of assume so. If it has AES-NI, then it should be good. You can check the arc.intel.com to see if that J1900 Bay Trail has it. If it does, then you should be all set. But I can't endorse it because I don't own one, so I have no idea.
Maybe one of our listeners and viewers has used those before. So
I've seen a lot of talk about it, so I would imagine somebody might have one and be able to write in and tell us.
Yeah, to feedback at bsdnow.tv, and we can cover it in a future show, so we reference this question. Okay, next is Sorap, and he's writing... Oh yeah, I remember this one. He writes, "Hi dear Alan, Mr. Benedict, and Chris. Yeah, still I hear that the place to be SD by instinct. Yeah, it's still in our heads. Yeah. So wanted to let you guys know how much I enjoy what you're doing, and while I'm surrounded by Linux and working as a Linux specialist, I'm just an insider who advocate using BSD instead. Haha.
Thank you.
Yeah, cool. I wanted to thank you for all the effort and love that you have in your activities. And P.S. Great to see that Benedict has already started to feel like home. Yeah, pretty much. Thanks. Keep up the good work," he writes, "and kind regards." Yeah, thank you.
Indeed.
Yeah, cool. It's definitely nice to hear positive feedback from people, and that they're doing also kind of advocacy in their small circle. Small things can become big really soon sometimes.
So yes, thank you for tuning in this week, and we look forward to being back next week. Do send your questions, comments, and show ideas and topics to us at feedback@bsdnow.tv. And if you have more questions for our viewer interview type section that we just did, make sure you set the title to, viewer interview question, and put your questions in there. And be sure to indicate if it's for a specific person or if it's for all of us, and we will continue to compile those and rattle off answers at you.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Enjoy your day and the rest of your week, and see you next week.